Today, Jena Khodadad is going to be our speaker. She has a PhD from Northwestern University in biological sciences, cell and molecular biology, and she will be utilizing that education for the web talk she gives us in July. Trying to think the date of that. I think it's probably July 19th, something like that. But we'll certainly have that listed, of course, and publicize it. She's also served in many institutions and agencies of the Baha'i Faith. She's been on the Regional Council for the Midwest, and she's been on the National Teaching Committee, if I remember right. She's an advocate of human rights and has made presentations on human rights before Amnesty International and the American Jewish Committee, particularly about the denial of education of the Baha'is in Iran. Her father was Hand of the Cause of God, Zekrullah Khadem, and she's given us a web talk about him. Her mother, Javidukht Khadem, is beloved to many of us and was an auxiliary board member, again, in the Chicago area for many years. Her most recent book has the exact same title as her talk today, The Dynamics of Growth, Scientific Principles at Work in the Worldwide Advancement of the Baha'i Faith, published by George Ronald. So you can still buy that book, I'm quite sure. It covers the growth of the Baha'i Faith in particular and compares it to the growth of religions in general. Jena and her husband, Manucher, live north of Chicago, as I said, in Winnetka, if I recall. So I will now turn this all over to Jena.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. I will start this presentation, which is a PowerPoint, a mode I prefer to use for a number of reasons. First of all, it conveys clarity. I can also use sometimes the sources of the writing, selections I use, and also it keeps me on track, which is the most important thing. I have a tendency to get excited from time to time and digress into expanding one area of what I'm speaking. So PowerPoint works very well, and I hope that it also worked for those who are in attendance. The book, The Dynamic of Growth, Scientific Principles at Work for the Worldwide Advancement of Baha'i Faith, is the focus of this webinar. The history of our faith bears the mark of those who have sacrificially labored in the path of growth. In a bare century after the declaration of Baha'u'llah's mission, have generated a widespread global community. I wish to launch this talk by paying tribute to those heroes and heroines who have made the Baha'i Faith global under the direction of the beloved guardian of Baha'i Faith, Shoghi Effendi. In the citadel of faith, Shoghi Effendi pays them tribute. They set out with dedication, light as the spirit, pure as air, blazing as fire, unrestrained as the wind, to proclaim the faith of Baha'u'lláh. Bracing the fearful cold of the Arctic regions and the enervating heat of the torrid zone, heedless of the hazards, the loneliness and the austerity of the deserts, the faraway islands and mountains wherein they will be called upon to dwell. It is likely that among us are the descendants of those stalwart heroes and heroines. Dedication to growth, the society-building power of this faith, continues to engage the entire Baha'i community. Let us now pause and reflect on the dynamics of growth of our faith. I want to call to your attention a couple of points. First, the word scientific in the subtitle of this book should not convey that it is for those with special knowledge and interest in science. Its science does not require calculations and formulas. Examples and similes and metaphors are included. Insights from these are discussed. They're of value in appreciation of the process of growth in dynamic system, notably the advancement of the Baha'i Faith. I make a point of this as at a certain stage in the development of this writing, one of my reviewers expressed that if I only take the word scientific out of the title, it will have greater appeal to a wider readership. However, my editor was adamant that the word scientific should remain in the title. She reasoned that its approach is novel, unlike anything yet published. This book can be of value to readers from a variety of backgrounds. Second point, its approach at first may seem unconventional, as it applies scientific concepts and principles to the growth and advancement of the worldwide Baha'i community, a process which is fundamentally spiritual. In the preface of this book, I share this point with the reader with these words. The moment I started to compose this book, I knew that writing its preface would be a task at once challenging and yet fulfilling. It would be challenging, for herein I must convey to the reader succinctly yet convincingly the intent, the why, the what, and the how of this writing. I must ask myself, what prompted me to write on the dynamics of growth of the Baha'i faith in a manner which may be perceived uncommon, unconventional? Will a book centered on the application of scientific concepts and principles to the growth and advancement of the worldwide Baha'i community, a process which is fundamentally spiritual, be well received? Can the use of metaphors, analogies, similes, and principles from science shed valuable insights on the dynamics of growth of the Baha'i faith? Reflection on these questions firmed my resolve to proceed. In line with the Baha'i principle of the harmony of science and religion, perspectives from science can add a valuable dimension to understanding the question of growth. Bahá'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá make extensive use of analogies, metaphors, and similes. Abdu'l-Bahá encourages their use in numerous passages, among them his talk on intelligible realities and their expression through sensible forms. In line with the Baha'i principle of harmony of science and religion, perspective from science can provide a valuable dimension to understanding the question of growth. Bahá'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá make extensive use of such devices. Abdu'l-Bahá encourages their use in numerous passages. My field of study, cell and molecular biology and neuroscience, have enhanced my appreciation that growth in dynamic systems is an orderly process. Once I decided to pursue this line of writing, my challenge became twofold: how to overcome the conventional barriers to this mode of discussion, and how to convey my arguments to the readers from diverse backgrounds in a manner that is cogent, clear, and meaningful. I hope I have accomplished this goal. It's really left to the reader to determine that. I want to share with you a few questions often asked by readers and blogs. Perchance they may also be of interest to those in attendance, such as, what do you hope to achieve with this book? The last of the series of the 5-year plans of the Baha'i world, launched in April, Rizwan 2016, by our supreme governing body, the Universal House of Justice, will culminate in 2021, the centenary of the formative age of the Baha'i faith. As we are now in the 3rd year of this latest 5-year plan, it is opportune and heartening to reflect on the growth of the Baha'i faith and its prospect for accelerated advancement in the years ahead. The challenge of growth is indeed within the purview of each believer, whose action is essential to growth at all levels. My interest in the question of growth goes back to the earlier years of my life in a country dominated by Shia Islam fundamentalism, and in a school, community school, later named Iran Zamin, dominated by Christian missionary zeal. At a young age, it became apparent to me that the solution to alienation and discord among religions requires a whole new way of thinking, a new worldview, paradigm, which can bring about harmony and fellowship among all religions. It was indeed a eureka moment when, as a child, I realized that such a model, oneness of religion, was already in existence. Now, in my more mature years, I refer to it by a more meaningful and sophisticated term, the long sought after unified theory, rather paradigm of religion. Thereafter, my persistent and insistent questions were, when will this unified premise of religion, the oneness of religion, become known and recognized by the masses? When will the Baha'i faith grow in a measure that is commensurate with its mission of embracing all humankind? As a child, I was impatient. My appreciation of time and process was lacking. Over the years, the question of growth continued to intrigue me. In my later years, I had the privilege of serving over a span of years on several agencies and institutions of the Baha'i Faith in this country, the centerpiece of whose mandate was significant enhancement in growth of its Baha'i community. Once again, the question of accelerated growth of Baha'i Faith, whose principles provide solutions to the pressing needs of humankind, resurfaced at the forefront of my consciousness with urgency. Over the years, a number of factors came together, germane to the growth and advancement of Baha'i community. Their convergence and relevance to the question of growth expanded my understanding. The outcome is this book. Soon after immersion in this writing, I realized the enormity of the task that lay ahead, grasping the challenge of growth. As Rumi writes, "Friend, we are traveling together. Throw off your tiredness. Let me show you one tiny spot of the beauty that cannot be spoken. I'm like an ant that's gotten into the granary, ludicrously happy and trying to lug out a grain that is way too big. With this awareness, I nonetheless ventured into this writing to lug out a grain that is way too big." A question often asked is, about the cover of this book. Why did I choose the butterfly image with its expanding web? Though the butterfly image is an artistic rendition for the book, it's beautiful and intriguing. What does it have to do with the focus of this book on growth? The image of butterfly on the cover of this book is especially relevant. It is thought-provoking. It signifies, in particular, two dynamic concepts among numerous others discussed. One is the concept developed in Chapter 5. It's the butterfly effect of the science of chaos. Briefly, in the science of weather, meteorology, it has been shown that the weak current generated by the flapping of the wings of a butterfly in one part of the world, under opportune conditions, can escalate to a tornado-like force in a distant part of the world. That is, under conditions unanticipated and opportune. The doctrine of Baha'i Faith can generate a monumental force. I defer a meaningful discussion of this point to the Chapter 5 of this book. The second point, on the image of the butterfly, it calls attention to one other dynamic concept developed in the book, as discussed in Chapter 7. Here it relates to an insightful analogy, the development of the butterfly in its cocoon, in its chrysalis. This analogy sheds insights on the stages in the development of a world civilization within the protective environment, the nurturing environment, within the chrysalis, the matrix, that which Shoghi Effendi calls the shell of the world order of Baha'u'lláh. This process and its insights are more fully expounded in chapter 7. This chapter 7, discusses and applies the insights of this metaphor to the development of a world civilization within the embrace of Baha'i Faith. As the world civilization is maturing, morphing, it must of necessity remain imperceptible to those surrounding, such that undisturbed, the butterfly can emerge with its wings fully developed, ready to soar. This metaphor offers several additional insights discussed in the book. It may explain why there is yet little awareness of the Baha'i Faith, the wisdom of it. Now a look at the book, The Dynamics of Growth, very briefly. Inspiration for this writing comes from the verses I have included in its frontispiece. Baha'u'lláh quotes these verses in Gems of Divine Mysteries from Ibn Farid. I knew not what amazement was until I made thy love my cause. Oh, how amazing would it be if I were not amazed by thee. The organization of this book. 10 chapters are organized under 3 parts. Analogies, metaphors, and similes are used throughout. These are offered for the reader's reflection. Similar devices have been used by all religions. Jesus Christ used parables, analogies, and metaphors. And to repeat, Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Bahá make extensive use of such means to explain and elucidate certain matters in order to expand and enhance perception and understanding. Abdu'l-Bahá explains and encourages their use and often asks the listener to reflect further on a specific example he provides, implying that this would lead to uncovering their hidden layers and dimensions. I want to emphasize that though such devices are offered in the interest of elucidating and expanding perceptions on certain essential points, they nevertheless do have their own limitations. The organization of this book is in 3 parts. Part 1, chapters 1 to 5, is centered on the fundamental factors entailed in the process of growth of Baha'i community. Part 2, chapters 6 to 9, centered on certain selected concepts and precepts of the Baha'i Faith that have direct relevance to the urgent needs of humanity in this era of globalization, and therefore these are bound to influence the worldwide acceptance and expansion of Baha'i Faith. And part 3 is the culmination. It's centered on the worldwide Baha'i community and the unification of world society. Now, a cursory look on part 1. Very brief, of course, time will not allow, just a few concepts. Chapter 1, the nature of growth. Chapter 2, enhancing growth from within. Chapter 3, the flow of plans and growth. Chapter 4, crystallization and growth. And Chapter 5, the science of chaos and a thousandfold growth. These chapters analyze and discuss numerous metaphors, analogies, and similes that shed insights on growth. I can only briefly refer to and comment on few selected concepts from these 5 chapters. Each example is discussed, of course, more extensively in the book, with its respective diagrams. So, Chapter 1, the nature of growth. Chapter 1 probes the nature of growth in dynamic systems. Those conditions that characterize growth in such systems include two inseparable dimensions of growth, that is, qualitative growth or transformation, and quantitative growth or growth in numbers. These must go hand in hand. One without the other cannot result in vital growth. Growth in numbers alone without transformation is like the growth of a weed, which can choke meaningful and vital growth. Also, growth in quality, that is, transformation without growth in numbers, will not do, especially for a religion whose mission is to bring together the entire human race. This diagram illustrates the essential relationship between the two: transformation, qualitative growth, and quantitative growth, growth in numbers. There is an essential dynamic interrelationship between the two. The nature of growth in dynamic systems is that growth takes place in phases. Some phases appear quiescent, wherein there is building up of resources. In this book, several metaphors and analogies from biological systems illustrate and explore this fundamental point. The key insights therein may be applied to the phased growth of Baha'i community. One of these analogies comes from self-division cycle, resulting in division of one biological cell into two, a process that is known as mitosis. You see, growth takes place in phases. Cells go through what is known as cell cycle, which ends in division of one cell into two. If we take the duration of 24 hours for a cell cycle, for most of that time, essentially all of that time, at first glance, that is for 23 hours, the cell appears quiescent. That is the interface. However, not so, because it seems like nothing is happening. Much is happening. If we use assays, we can show that much is happening. Much of this period is building capacity, that it can be subdivided into a number of phases. Gap 1, synthesis of DNA, gap 2, and then in the 24th hour, there is mitosis, one cell becomes two. Now, why am I including this metaphor? Because I think it holds insights. The question is, could it possibly provide an explanation on what may be happening in Baha'i communities through the core activities? Capacity building, in anticipation, in preparation for increase in numbers? Here's a thought. Now on to chapter 2, very briefly, enhancing growth from within. We recognize that there are factors internal to Baha'i community that are indispensable to growth, such as vision, passion, and the building of strong, indissoluble bonds. Additionally, this chapter also offers powerful metaphors and analogies from science. I want to highlight just two among its several metaphors. That is, the principle of co-evolution, the phenomenon of co-evolution, comes from biological sciences. Co-evolution defines the mutual evolutionary impact of species that are intimately linked and dependent on one another. Co-evolution is a widespread phenomenon. Its implications range from biological species to molecular evolution to the evolution of systems on the grand scale of galaxies and beyond. Through the process of co-evolution, The evolution of one species influences the evolution of other species to which it's intimately linked. This dynamic process has continuing mutual effect on each of its component entities. It progressively augments the evolution and maturation of them all. The Baha'i administrative systems has the implications of co-evolution. That is for the vitality of Baha'i administrative system, whose constituent elements, the individual, the local community, the national community, and the international community are interdependent and should be tightly linked to one another. I leave further discussion of this dynamic principle to the second chapter of the Dynamics of Growth, Scientific Principles at Work in the Worldwide Advancement of Baha'i Faith. Another example from this chapter 2, often quoted by readers of this book, is the metaphor of analogy, a metaphor or analogy of the laser beam, the generation, empowerment, and action of the laser beam. The metaphor of laser beam has stimulated insightful discussion and generated numerous comments, responses from readers. This chapter 2, probes the rich insights offered by this powerful metaphor. Briefly, in the generation of the laser beam, connection to power is energizing the activity. The resulting laser beam is empowered to carry on the task. Thus, the generated laser beam offers an insightful metaphor for empowerment and collective action. It is possible to spend an entire session in discussion of the laser beam, and it does happen. I leave all that discussion, of course, to the book. Suffice it for now that the process of generation of the laser beam, its properties of coherence, alignment, and focus are discussed in relation to individual action and collective action. Once generated, the laser beam can perform a wide variety of tasks, such as surgery and even welding of metals. Likewise, connection to the source, the generator, the revelation of Bahá'u'lláh, that as a laser beam. Moving on quickly now, beyond this very important concept, nevertheless, to chapter 3, which is the flow of plans and growth. This is the longest chapter in the book. It summarizes in some detail the plans and the phases in the plans of the Baha'i world, starting from the unveiling of the Tablets of Divine Plan in 1919 to this very date. This chapter serves as a prelude to chapter 4. Chapter 4, crystallization and growth. Chapter 4 probes the crystallization of the Baha'i community into a structure whose hallmark is purity. It is the shortest chapter in the book, but took the longest to write. Near the end, still my editor was saying, but where is chapter 4? And I said, I'm still working on it. As the exciting insights of crystallization began to dawn on me, I knew that I wanted to convey my understanding with utmost clarity. Thus I spent much time in rewriting over and over again the shortest chapter of all. What makes it special is the extent and depth of its implications and insights. Several of these I have discussed in chapter 4. Some are for the reader to explore and discover. And now I will explain only few. The process of crystallization suggests that our current low rate of growth could be just part of a process which precedes a rapid phase of growth. So this is where we were. This is the process of nucleation, which is slow. And then after a critical number of concentration of sugar is in the solution, then it proceeds on into the stage of crystal formation. And this stage is known to be rapid. Are we now in the slow phase of nucleation? Once a critical mass of those who espouse these principles is reached, could we look to the rapid phase of crystal formation, leading to its remarkable product, the crystal? Excitedly, we can anticipate such glorious outcome. One other among several insights of the process of crystallization is the characteristics of that much sought after product, the crystal. A crystal has structure, symmetry, beauty, but foremost its hallmark is purity. Such is the anticipated outcome at all levels, the individual and the community. Though the thought of such a crystal must continue to captivate and invigorate us, I must now get past it and take a brief look at chapter 5. The science of chaos and a thousandfold growth. Chapter 5 focuses on a number of factors which can significantly enhance the growth of Baha'i Faith. These are unforeseen and unanticipated growth factors that lie beyond the direct influence and control of the three key protagonists of growth, the individual, the community, and the institutions. Those unforeseen factors, external to the Baha'i community, under opportune conditions, hold such power as to spur a sudden increase of a thousandfold in the growth of the Baha'i Faith. A statement from Shoghi Effendi foreshadows such a glorious prospect. Suddenly will revolutionize the fortunes of the faith, derange the equilibrium of the world, and reinforce a thousandfold the numerical strength, as well as the material power and the spiritual authority of the faith of Baha'u'lláh. Among several phenomena of this discusses the dynamic science of chaos in chapter 5, to which I have already alluded. It's one of the most significant discoveries of the 20th century. Now on to part 2, which includes chapter 6, the twofold process and growth, the flow of history and growth, paradigm of oneness of religion, and progressive revelation and growth. All these themes are discussed in a novel and insightful manner through the use of metaphors, analogies, paradigms, using illustrations as well. Now only a brief look at chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6, the twofold process and growth. Chapter 6 introduces the dynamic concept of newly emergent entities from natural sciences. It is a fascinating discussion. I will not take the liberty of getting into that discussion, but I would like to refer the reader to the discussion in the book. Newly emerging entities essentially are those entities that come about which change the probabilities and possibilities of things happening. The examples given in the book, one is the generation of oxygen in the atmosphere, and the other example is the birth of a new star in our universe. These are related to the birth of the twin manifestations and the possibilities that they generated in creation. The metaphor of hidden image is part of this chapter, and I will take very few minutes in order to talk about the metaphor of hidden image. What it is, very briefly, is that the Baha'is in general do believe that of the two processes, the constructive and the destructive, the constructive is going to prevail. And many look at us thinking we are simpletons, believing such a thing. My explanation is through the hidden image. That is an image which has within it hidden another image. So if we were shown such an image at first glance, we would say this is a jungle, jungle with a lot of growth, and around each corner of it there may be some dangers lurking. However, if the hidden image is first shown and articulated, that of a mansion or of a castle, now when we look at the composite, we immediately see the hidden image. This is just to illustrate that what has happened to the Baha'i mindset, it has been explained in our sacred writings of the eventuality of the ultimate, the constructive process taking hold the world order of Bahá'u'lláh. And so it is with that kind of assurance that our belief is that the constructive process will ultimately prevail. Chapter 7, on flow of history and growth. Briefly, this chapter starts with a discussion and critique of prevailing alternative views on the course of history. According to noted philosopher of history, Arnold J. Toynbee, he talks about the linear or cyclic modes of thinking, worldviews about history. The chapter also includes a proposed Baha'i view of history, that being an ascending spiral. At this point, I would like to refer you to chapter 7 for the diagrams on views of history, which on a number of settings, a number of conferences, have resulted in discussion and discourse with those in attendance and also with the readers of this book. Oh, I'm including these. I thought one is the linear view of history, according to Toynbee, and that is the Zoroastrian, Judeo-Christian, Muslim view of history, that is at a certain point in history with an advent of a prophet of God, of a manifestation of God, history takes on a forward, a progressive course. And the other is cyclic, that is the Buddhist and the Greco-Hindu view also, that history just simply repeats itself, and Toynbee has a fascinating discussion why neither one of these are acceptable views of history, which leads then to offering the thinking of what is the Baha'i view of history, and that was the ascending spiral, which is proposed in the book, and that in turn also can generate a lot of discussion. One of the important points on this, it's a repetition, but it needs emphasis on this chapter, is the chrysalis idea, to which I have already referred at the beginning of this talk, on the use of butterfly on the cover of this book. That is the gradual and phased development of a world civilization within the matrix, the chrysalis of the world order of Bahá'u'lláh. This is a metaphor which warrants in-depth reflection. Now on to chapters 8 and 9, the paradigm of oneness of religion and the progressive revelation, chapter 9. Among Baha'is, there is a traditional way of discussing the principle of oneness of religion and progressive revelation. However, in this book, these themes are explored in a novel manner against the background of the structure of scientific revolution proposed by Thomas Kuhn. The analysis and discussion of stages entailed in paradigm expansion or paradigm shift provide an understanding of the stages entailed in rejection, acceptance, adoption, and assimilation of the Baha'i paradigm of oneness of religion and progressive revelation. When that assimilation takes place, the whole mindset, the universe within, changes and transforms. One sees with new eyes. In chapter 9, progressive revelation is explained by employing several diagrams based on understanding of the relationship and interconnection among religions. And now on to the very last chapter, which is the worldwide Baha'i community and the unification of world society. This part has only that one chapter as a culmination to the book. It's tender and heartwarming. It transitions to the role of the worldwide Baha'i community in unification of world society. It evokes the powerful tablet of the word of Baha'u'lláh, Lawh Dunya, wherein Baha'u'lláh addresses his believers with ever so much love, tenderness, and compassion. It says, "Wherefore fear ye, O my well-beloved ones? Who is it that can dismay you? A touch of moisture sufficeth to dissolve the hardened clay out of which this perverse generation is molded." Herein the metaphor of a structure of clay, unstable and prone to crumbling, is applied to the old world order. The image of feet of clay is an insightful and powerful metaphor from the book of Daniel in Old Testament, describing the meaning of the dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. The worldwide Baha'i community and unification of world society, with its anticipated outcome in the emergence of a new human, a new race of women and men. Part 1 of the discussion in this chapter draws its insights from Toynbee's most recent book that has been published, and that is Change and Habit, published in 1992 by One World, on the role of white world communities he calls diasporas in unification of the human race. And he considers the Baha'i diaspora as one of them. It's a fascinating report. What he says, diasporas can be vital in unification of the world because they don't belong into any one place. Their conscience is worldwide. And so taking those themes from his writings, it's developed in a theme in that last chapter that indeed the Baha'i Faith qualifies as the most distinctive diaspora capable of carrying on that mandate of bringing the entire society together, unifying them under one global civilization. So I stop there, but there is a lot of discussion about that in the book itself, and it's really what excites me quite a bit, because it was a rather new finding for me. I want to thank all of you for your attendance, and I do hope that these have been meaningful to you, and that you may be encouraged to delve into the book and find new insights, and then inform me of those. That is how I can enrich my own thinking.
Thank you so much, Jena. That was fascinating. I had heard some of this, I think, at an Erfan colloquium, and it was nice to hear it again. And I've been thinking a lot about this whole question of growth, and it occurs to me that we also have had phases in the growth of the faith, where, for example, there generally is a focus on internal community building and then on institution building, and then perhaps more on community building. It seems to alternate almost, with focusing in Iran, first of all, on building a community amongst these scattered and persecuted individuals, and then you have Baha'u'lláh pointing the hands and Abdu'l-Bahá establishing local governing bodies, and then similarly in the West with the emphasis on local assemblies, and then institution building, national assemblies, and going out and pioneering. And now we're back in a community building phase, but it's a different kind of community building phase. So it's fascinating to watch the growth and the cycles of growth in the faith. I think what I particularly appreciate about your approach is that you really gave us a lot of examples and analogies. And that's, I think, probably very useful, because it's very hard, obviously, to use statistics to be sure what's coming. As we've all seen, statistics are often not, first of all, they're not always accurate, and second of all, they're not always very predictive. So I found this particular approach very useful. in thinking about the growth of the faith. Let me see if what the situation is with questions. We don't have any questions yet. Oh yeah, we do.
Jena, just to interrupt, can you see Rob okay now? You can exit your slide presentation if you want by hitting the escape key, and then you can see him. I've switched it off from you now.
Okay, I can see Rob.
Great.
Yeah, Paul says, could you please elaborate a bit more about the process of crystallization as it relates?
Do you want me to get back on that figure, or just, well, the process of crystallization is the way it is in crystallization. That first period where those nuclei are formed, it's very slow.
Right.
And the second stage is very fast. And so the moment I came to that understanding, immediately for me, I related it to the growth of Baha'i faith. But the point is that during that first stage, before even nucleation sets in that very first stage, there must be a critical concentration of the sugar molecule, which means we must have a critical mass of those who are Baha'is, who have converted to Baha'i faith. Right. I don't simply have gone to various study circles and so forth, but who are committed as Baha'is. And when that happens, and I can't tell you what that critical mass is, we certainly don't have it right now. And when that happens, that is when the nucleation process proceeds, because it can't even proceed without that happening. And then suddenly it goes into crystallization. That was the message, that was the insight it held for me. And then also the crystal itself must have those qualities of purity. Our communities, as individuals, as communities, collectively, we must achieve that state of, ultimately, of purity as a crystal. Do you think I'm seeing too much in these metaphors?
Well, I think they're useful. I think they are useful. It's the same. It's not just with sugar molecules, but in the clouds in the sky, you have to have motes of dust or something to get the raindrops started. And once you have that little source, you can add the water to it, and you can get your raindrops or your snowflakes if it's cold enough. So yeah, that, I think it's a useful analogy. And in fact, it can grow very, very fast. There are situations, I've heard stories of super cooled liquids where if something suddenly starts ice formation, it'll all form very quickly. So yeah, that can definitely happen. And I think your analogy, your insight that the Baha'i approach to history is both linear and cyclical at the same time is quite useful. It gives us a clear idea of how progressive revelation works, with advancement, but sometimes, to some extent, perhaps a little bit of a fallback, but not as far back as it did. And then a new advance for humanity with another manifestation. I think that's really quite true.
It's interesting you say that, Rob, because last year in Irfan, I presented the spiral view, and I explained no diagram can capture the essence of a process that is so dynamic. And we had about half an hour discussion on that. There were engineers and various others who participated in that discussion. Yes.
I remember that. Yes, I was there.
I remember that. Yeah.
I was at Bosch. The one at Bosch. Maybe you did it another place too, but at Bosch.
Yes.
Yeah, that was quite interesting. And unfortunately, we see some of this, shall we say, setback going on right now, I think, in our own society, with the decline of morality and the decline of concern about morality, the decline of consultation, the decline of the quality of public discourse, which shows probably an increased, what's the word I want, increased egotism in the population, in the society right now.
Oh yes.
What are some of the other? Are there any other analogies you were thinking about of including in the book that you never completely came through a way of doing it? What other ideas have you had that you could have included, perhaps?
You mean in this presentation or in the book?
In the book. In the book.
Yes, so there are quite a few, but I have to develop them. I have to think more about those. But this concept of, are you quite familiar with what Aaron Toynbee is saying about diaspora in that book?
No, I haven't. I'm not familiar with Toynbee's argument about that. I've read a summary of Toynbee once, but that was a long time ago.
Because this is a late publication. I don't know how One World published it, because I don't know what was the year that Toynbee passed away. But apparently, yeah, quite a while. So I was surprised to find this book, and when I read it, what he's talking about diasporas, and he goes, into explanation of why diasporas are the means to unification of the world. I read on and on, knowing that he also mentioned the Baha'i diaspora, and then I started thinking about diaspora. Well, the whole usage of the word diaspora itself at one time was not acceptable in Baha'i settings, but I do think that it's an appropriate term. We are spread across the planet, so we are widespread. We are widespread not because to seek fortune and other means that has resulted in some other diasporas, or to run away from persecution, although some of that has been there. But essentially, the Baha'i diaspora has been generated because of Baha'is going out sacrificially to plant this seed all over the world. Yeah. And it's a diaspora which is not self-centered. Mm-hmm. Its primary focus is not its self-preservation. Other diasporas talk about fear of becoming extinct, that is how to preserve themselves, but this is not the concept of that Baha'i diaspora or widespread community holds. And because of a whole series of reasons, the Baha'i diaspora is the only diaspora that qualifies for bringing about the unification of the human race. Its acceptance of all religions, of cultures, all nationalities. It's a microcosm of humanity, and its very beliefs makes it the top candidate for bringing that about. So
it's a diaspora of the oneness of mankind, ultimately, also, when you consider all the intermarriages that are produced with people of Iranian background intermarried with people all over the world, and then their children in turn intermarrying even further. It's really quite a remarkable creating of the oneness of humanity in a particular community. So yeah, I agree. Jean asks whether you could expand on the analogy of the laser beam further.
Oh yes, you see, with the laser beam, it has to be the beam that we get has many wavelengths. So under appropriate conditions, and I'm not an engineer, so I can't tell you exact conditions, this beam is then converted into a beam where the quanta, a number of different wavelengths, and there has been more than half of these wavelengths fall together, are coherent.
Right.
A laser beam is generated. And then that laser beam, based on its specification, what it is to do, can be put to work. So it does a lot of things, surgery, welding of metals, and it's used throughout. But the idea that once you're connected to that source of energy, and here in this metaphor, that source of energy for Baha'is towards action would be their source, the very source, revelation of Baha'u'lláh. I don't mean secondary routes, but primary route to really get into the writings of Baha'u'lláh, the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, and that can stimulate us to generate that laser beam where this is very interesting. As long as more than half of the population of those wavelengths fall in phase together, a laser beam is generated to carry on. That is the point. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
There's
intriguing.
a lot more to it.
That's intriguing. Nikki makes this comment. She says, "I don't know who said this, but one quote that has struck stuck with me over many years is the idea of, quote, what man can imagine can be achieved, unquote. What you said about the worldview of the faith being like a hidden image, which anyone can see once they are shown it, resonates with that quote for me. That's an interesting analogy, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. And that quote was, could you give me some of the key words so I can...
what man can imagine
okay.
can be achieved. Maybe Nikki knows where it came from. I don't know. Maybe she'll post it when she gets the chance.
Okay, I can find it. Now, I don't know, if you have other questions, then I will hold my comment. Or shall I go on?
Go ahead, comment. Go ahead. I don't have any other questions right here, right now. Go ahead.
I quickly flashed on the screen emerging entities, newly emerging entities. But this is a very, very important concept. As I started reading this passage, the quote from Bahá'u'lláh, where newly emerging entities is included, all of a sudden I reflected back to a couple of years back, reading a book by Sir John Eccles, a Nobel laureate neuroscientist, who had contributed the chapter to a book, The Uniqueness of Man. And he talks about newly emerging entity. And in his case, he was talking about the emergence of man. But when I read, all of a sudden it dawned on me that it has relevance to the theme of newly emerging entities in the sacred writings. What it says is that there are two examples of newly emerging entities. One is the oxygen. There was a time that oxygen, atmospheric oxygen, as O2, was absent from atmosphere. It was the result of photosynthetic molecules that oxygen was generated. Carbon dioxide and water generate carbohydrates, released oxygen. After that, animal life became possible. And sentient beings came into being, human beings came into being. And so what was impossible before became possible. Right. And also there's an example of when a new star is created in our physical universe. Of course, its source has been elsewhere, but once that new star is generated, it creates a lot of tension around itself, pulls and attracts. So I took this concept, and for me, it related to the advent of the twin manifestations, the Bab and Bahá'u'lláh, and the creativity that has been generated since their advent, the increase in science and technology, the increase in all of the advancements that have been far exceeded all the centuries before.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And similarly, I suspect with the creation of an oxygen atmosphere also, for many billions of years, the concentration of oxygen was so low, it was really of no use to practically anything. Mm-hmm. But once it reached a critical mass, then the quantity could take off in the atmosphere because suddenly it became a common resource that otherwise was unavailable. And so plants were able to use it more widely, and then animals were able to use it. So you have that analogy, similar to the crystallization analogy. You'll have a takeoff with the growth once that becomes available. And I think there's some aspects of the faith that are that way. I suspect that the ability that we have to build communities as we continue to develop that ability and continue to strengthen it, we will find that probably feeding back on itself and accelerating as well, so that there will be a faster and faster effort to more and more successful effort to build communities. Nikki says she thinks Jules Verne was the source of the quote, anything one man can imagine, other men can make real, I guess is the exact quote she has. And Paul says, yours is a message of hope to the masses in the faith who have felt sadness about the slow pace of growth overall. I think that's true. I think that's a very good point, that when we're looking at the growth rate and it starts very low and of course it eventually picks up quite sharply, parabolically, when we're down here at the bottom watching it move very slowly, we don't really notice the parabolic upturn is coming.
It could also be that we have to tap into the sacred writings and become like that. laser beam additionally to what is taking place right now in neighborhoods.
We're not coherent enough as individual members of the community. That's true. Yeah, like coherent light. I think that's a good point. Jeanette says, does the science of aging or decline or death, as opposed to the opposite of growth, give us further analogies to help our understanding regarding the old world order rolling up with the new world order taking its place? Interesting idea.
Does it mean science of aging as an individual, as a human?
Well, in order to look at the old world order, for example, like the analogy of an individual aging and dying. And are there any insights there that she's looking for?
It gets me. What do you think, Rob? I mean, I'm wondering, aging, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the more young, the better, the more vital, the more. I think that
there are certainly terms we use for our own political system and our own society, terms like sclerotic, for example, which refer to physical declines of the human body. So I think there are certainly the aches and pains of aging are, you might say, seen in our society as well, in the old world order that is not doing so well right now.
But if we take it to the human side of a human being aging, and then going through that decline ultimately, but if we were to put two curves, what my understanding is that as the physical curve goes on a downswing, then the spiritual curve concomitant with that should go on the upswing. That is what religions teach us. That's what I understand from Baha'i Faith, that on the purpose of life. So as we are aging and declining, then concomitant with that should be another process that goes that way. Maybe it doesn't make sense, but it does to me.
Well, perhaps that refers to the decline of the old world order and the rise of the new world order, perhaps.
That too.
In that sense. Boyd passes this one on from YouTube. Can you ask Mrs. Khodadad what the significance of a 19-day month is scientifically? Is there a scientific significance to the 19-day month?
I'm not aware of it. Are you, Rob?
Not right offhand. I mean, other than 19 times 19 is 361, which is very close to the number of days in the year. That's about the only scientific connection that I can think of right offhand. There's no biological cycles tied to 19s that I'm aware of right offhand, for example. So nothing we can think of there. Well, I think that wraps up the questions right offhand. Perhaps we'll get a few more, but well, we've got another one. No, Boyd says there aren't any others from Facebook or from YouTube, because he's been checking those sources for us where we have other audiences. We have audiences today in 3 different places, so it's a little hard to keep track of everybody's questions. But I don't see any other questions. So, Shahala just gave us a question here, a comment. Abdu'l-Bahá talks about a fruit-free aging and being no longer fruitful. A fruit tree aging and being no longer fruitful as a metaphor for the power of the old religions declining and a seed taking from it to grow a new tree. So there we have an analogy also.
That's a good one. That's a really good one.
Yeah, definitely. So perhaps we can switch now to looking at what's coming up. And again, I thank you very much for this marvelous presentation. And I'm sure everyone has greatly enjoyed it. And we'll have it, of course, up on our website fairly quickly, so people will be able to watch the recording as well.